Welcome to Madame Raven's. This way to the library. She's been expecting you.
My best friend died when we were children. It's 10 years later, and she's clawing at my window. By Lighthouse Horror. At first, I was confused, and then I was terrified. Grace? It was 20 after midnight, and for the first time since I was a child, I saw my best friend. The problem is, she died a long time ago. Let me in, Jessica. Nearly jumping out of bed, I stared through the thin red curtains and stained glass. Her face was muddled in the darkness, but I knew it was her. I knew. Something told me not to look further, that if I were to stare into her eyes, I might never come back. Still, I had to be sure. I had changed locations recently, moving to the 14th floor of an apartment building in a forgotten part of Los Angeles. There had been complaints of rats and other vermin, and though the place wasn't yet condemned, it was most likely on its way. Jessica, it's me. Torn sections of wallpaper fluttered in the wind along with my old friend, a reminder that I had left the window open just a crack. I prayed it wouldn't be enough for her to... Jessica, the raspy voice repeated, seeming to float gently just outside the glass. I summoned all of my courage and asked her the only question I could think of. How are you here? The soft breeze from the window suddenly became violent, and one strip of wallpaper tore clean off the wall. You know how. Now let me in. And with that, I fell to my knees and began to cry. 10 years later, 10 years of therapy, and 10 years of prayer, and 10 years of them saying I had imagined it all, that I had imagined the thing in the forest. It hadn't been there when the police returned. Oh, sweetie, you made all that up. Everyone has a different way to cope, my mother had said. Maybe I did need to cope, but I hadn't imagined anything. 10 years ago, Grace and I had gone together into the woods to try and make a fire. We weren't ones to be outdone by the boys, and earlier that week my brother had made a very stupid comment, even by his standards. Girls are too dumb to make fires, the Boy Scout of 3 weeks had stated with a grin. That was more ammunition than we needed. And later that day, Grace and I had researched different fire-building techniques. And before finally going with the old newspaper and matches routine, our town sat on the edge of a national forest, and we knew various campsites we could sneak into that would give us a hidden place to practice in silence. We lied to our parents, as they would have never let us venture out so far. And as it just so happened, we did become lost on our way. Even worse, almost as if planned, the rain began to pour down heavily and soak what little clothes we had brought on our journey, not having had the foresight to bring a jacket. We did the best we could and sought shelter under a rocky overhang we hadn't seen before. The rain fell in clumps now, and if I had been with anyone else, I might have felt afraid, but not Grace. Though she wasn't my actual sister, she may as well have been. I loved Grace and trusted her. I trusted her with my life. Within a minute or two, I felt something soft and warm around my ankle before being pulled violently away from my friend and through an unseen hole in the rocks. I managed to stay conscious as I screamed out to my friend for help. Grace! Suddenly I was in a vast cavern that shone brightly. lit with some powerful force that I still can't explain. The luminescence was almost blinding, yet in my state of confusion I managed to stand. Once I'd been pulled inside completely, the warming thing that had grabbed me relented its hold on my leg. Maybe it figured there was no escaping now anyway. What I saw next is so frightening that I doubt you'll believe me. Nearly crying, I spun around rapidly to examine the cave and found that I wasn't alone. Many of my neighbors were there, and even some of my friends. How did... My voice stammered and fell short as I realized something was very wrong. They weren't moving, and they looked different, almost shiny. Though to anyone else the figures might have passed for human, I knew these people, and I could tell their eyes, through the correct color, were blank and frightening. They weren't alive, yet dead. I began to back up slowly when I felt a hand grasp my shoulder. I screamed and fell backwards onto the far too warm floor of the cave. "Jessica," Grace whispered, "we have to get out of here." Not even thinking twice, she had crawled through the rocky hole after me. I wonder to this day if I would have done the same for her. We held hands as the two of us walked backwards towards the opening, never letting our eyes off the creatures that lined the walls around us. And then they moved. Our neighbors and our friends began to walk towards us. Some shuffled awkwardly, while others began to do something far worse. Their bodies split open, revealing a sharp, elaborate group of tentacles where their heart and organs should have been. The figures circled around us, and I knew that there could be no escape. Her words cut through the darkness. "Light a match, Jessica," she called up to me, having already torn the newspaper we planned on using for a fire into a small pile on the floor. "What?" I asked shakily, but there was no fear in her voice. "Do it. They're going to kill us anyway, and I don't want to be one of those bad things." Neither did I. What else could I do but light the match? And with it, the entire cavern began to erupt in flames. The monsters watched in shock, and then rage. Their anger made them fast as they shuffled towards us. But we were fast, too, young and fast. We crawled through the rocks with a speed we didn't know we had, the intense heat of the fire burning our ankles and shoes. I emerged from the small hole first, with Grace right behind me. But when I knelt down to offer her my hand, I was a split second too late. I could feel her fingers scrape along my palm as she screamed and was pulled back into the inferno. That was 10 years ago, almost to the day. "Let me in," Grace whispered from the outside of the 14th floor window. I realized that she wasn't floating, but clinging. The tentacles from her chest dug deeply into the stone and concrete of the old apartment building. Maybe I will let her in. I think I owe her that much. She has become like they are. Don't fear the Reaper. Blue Oyster Cult. My old friend's words seemed to echo through the old apartment. "Let me in, Jessica." So I did. Pushing aside the thin red curtains, I stared through the stained glass into the eyes of my long dead, or so I thought, best friend. For a moment I became lost, and as her eyes met mine they seemed to smile, glowing a bright red that outdid the new red curtains I had purchased only 2 weeks earlier. Her figure couldn't be made out completely in the darkness, but my mind had already been made up. I owed her this much at least. Whatever happens next, I owe her this much. The apartment was a much older design, than maybe most you're familiar with. The cracked stained glass window went from ceiling to floor, now only open a crack at the very bottom. Something like this would probably be against regulations nowadays, and was just another reason for the old apartment building to be shut down completely. I had read a story when I was younger about a little girl falling to her death from such a flawed design. As I reached under the handle and began to pull upwards, I wondered if this might be the very apartment where it had happened. Silly thought, I know, but it was there anyway. I thought of how easy it would be for a person to fall to their death from such a place. With a creak, I pushed the window open completely, a warm breeze making its way eerily into my bedroom. Grace smiled, and her red eyes made me step back into the corner near my bed. Looking up at the silver cross next to me, I figured it wouldn't do any good if things went bad. When things went bad. She wasn't a vampire, after all. She was something else entirely. Something dead yet alive. Something ancient yet young. Very young. I witnessed the monster's figure now coming more into view. Grace was still a little girl, just as she had been that night many years ago, after she'd been taken. Life had continued for me. School and college and new friends. For Grace, life had ended that night she had saved me. Grace took a step forward into the apartment, her wet tentacles retreating momentarily under her clean white dress, stitched with yellow dandelions. "Mind if I sit down?" she asked. "Please do," I replied cordially. Her strong hands reached out and grasped the old rocker my mom had given me before passing. She sat, and something caught her eye, an old photo of the two of us together. As she picked it up to take a closer look, her eyes changed from a bright, piercing red to the pale green I had remembered. It had been taken the summer before she died by her father. In the picture, the two of us were standing at the edge of a pond near our home, embracing each other like sisters, and smiling. We had always been smiling. Grace's eyes looked over at me. "You saved this, huh?" There was silence for a moment. "Of course I saved it." And then sadness. "You're my best friend, Grace." "I was your best friend," she interjected. And for a moment I could see the underlying resentment for the first time. I couldn't blame her. My friend's eyes turned red again, though the room was only partially lit. I could see the outline of a tentacle making its way slowly across the floor towards me. I was 10 or so feet away, and it stopped just a few inches from my ankle as she spoke again. "So why did you let me in, Jessica?" Her fiery red pupils examined me closely. "Want to become like we are?" she continued, grinning as the tentacle inched its way closer. I could feel it at the edge of my skin now, as if it were a creature sniffing its prey before biting deep. I wanted to say I'm sorry, Grace. Surprise fell over her face. "You're sorry?" she asked. Her voice changed from the little girl I remember to something deeper and almost demonic. "You're sorry?" she repeated, her full figure coming into view. An endless series of tentacles filled the room now, fluttering angrily. The ceiling fan crashed onto the floor as they slid over it, and I watched in horror as the largest tentacle grabbed the photo of us together and shattered the glass frame. "I have something better than sorry, Jessica. I'm going to make you like I am. You're going to see what it's like to..." It was my turn to interrupt. And I want to keep my promise this time. You want to what? She asked quietly, but there was rage underneath her words. For the first time, I could feel the tentacles wrap quickly around my ankles and begin to dig in. I'm so sorry, Grace, I continued, pulling out the revolver I had concealed in my jacket and shooting her twice in the chest. There was no scream of pain as the tentacles retreated back under her dress, nor any look of betrayal. My best friend only fell back into the corner of the floor, stared up at me. There was no anger anymore. Her eyes changed completely now from the bright red of a monster back to the pale green of her youth. I walked over, tears now falling easily from my face onto the floor below. She spoke more quietly now as the life began to drain from her body. Don't be sorry, Jessica, she whispered, her pale green eyes looking into mine. I could tell she wanted to say something else, tears now falling down her face as well, but she was no longer able to. My friend didn't have long left, I realized, and she was only able to make one last gesture, reaching out towards the broken picture I had kept of us as children. Her eyes met mine one last time. It was cracked and broken now, face down on the floor in front of us. I did as she asked, lifting the photo from the floor and placing it in her hands carefully. She smiled, and then I sat down with her, protecting Grace like I should have done so many years ago. I put my face up against hers, and we both gazed down on the old photo of us together. We had been just children, but even then Grace and I knew what we were. Best friends forever. So quoth this raven. I hope you liked this little story, my darlings. I found it absolutely charming, and many thanks to the author, Lighthouse Horror, for allowing me to read it. Stephen R. Gray. Please, my darlings, check out the link in the description and visit his book that is coming out. Thank you all so much for coming to visit. You know I live for these little visits. And a special thanks to my Patreon supporters, Charlotte Emerson, Ermin Case, Darren and Jennifer, and Laura. If you like this, please hit the little button to let me know. If you didn't, hit the little button to let me know. Leave a comment. I'm always glad to talk with you, my darlings. I'm open to suggestions and criticisms, critiques. If you have not subscribed, please do so and ring the little bell so you know when to come up and see me. And I will talk to you next time, my darlings.